This is the group resources video for episode 105 of the BEMA podcast, titled An Explosive Kingdom. And a lot of commentary, like a lot of buzz around this episode. I don't know if there was a ton of emails or feedback that necessarily requires a ton of follow-up. A lot of people, there's a ton of conversation that just goes on. A lot of people find the two-part versus three-part eschatology conversation very, very helpful. I know I do. And they thought the presentation was super helpful, so hopefully you were able to pull that up and use that during discussion group and talk about... I also let me get to questions later. Obviously this is one episode where I really leaned into it's not my theory, the theory that my teacher taught me, that John the Baptist was Jesus's rabbi, and we use that term somewhat informally because there's nothing about this situation that would have been formal. There's nothing about this that matches the norm, and everybody gets really they write me a lot of emails about that idea. How can you think that John the Baptist was Jesus' rabbi? He's a cousin. He's only 6 months older than Jesus. They're peers. He's not an authority. All that kind of stuff. And I get that. That would be the normal objection to the idea. The problem is that there's nothing normal about John the Baptist or Jesus. They're not fitting the cultural norms. Everything they do is outside the cultural norms. Every time they do something, the whole status quo can't figure out exactly where to label it or where to categorize it or where to put it. And so, no, this isn't normal. And I think that's actually the point. I think Jesus's birth story, his birth narrative, would have been something that people would have been skeptical about. I think it would have kept him from a lot of being accepted in normal education circles or normal teachers. Not that he would have been an all-out mumser. There is a scholar, his name is Bruce Chilton, that he believes Jesus would have been seen culturally as a mumser, as an illegitimate bastard child, and would have been excluded from a lot of things. And I think there's probably some truth to that. I don't know if I go that far, but there probably would have been a stigma around who Jesus was and where he came from. So yeah, I think it's one of the reasons why John the Baptist, his peer, his cousin, who was potentially, it seems like a ton of evidence in the Gospels, trained in an Essene worldview. So John is more trained and more learned than the average person. He's very capable. He's making a huge, a public splash. Everybody seems to be aware of his ministry and what's going on. I think it's more than plausible that Jesus's cousin, his peer, says, hey, how about we study, nobody else is going to take you, I'm going to take you. And maybe John did that ministry, It doesn't fit the exact mold we would expect, but this is one of many stories where the way that Jesus talks about John the Baptist, the way that conversation takes place it sounds very rabbi-disciple to me. Like somebody who used to be his disciple. This is an old rabbi of mine. Here's Jesus taking a new stance on things that John the Baptist is asking about and all of that. And he's taking a different take on it than his potential rabbi. And then he turns around at the end of that and says, I don't want anybody to think that I'm bad-mouthing my rabbi. My rabbi's the greatest man born of woman, and that whole conversation, that whole thing feels, and it's not the only time. I feel like every single time we have a Jesus and John the Baptist encounter, it feels very much like it fits this mold. And I know the first time I heard that idea, I thought it was crazy. And then over the years, the more I look at each and every one of those stories, the more I'm like, man, and when Jesus is asked, where does your authority come from? What does he say? Well, what do you think about John the Baptist's authority? Why would that be? Is he just arbitrarily pulling that question out of the clouds? Or is he a disciple of John? And so if he's going to answer their question, where does your authority come from? Jesus wants to know, well, in order for me to answer that, I need to know where you stand on John the Baptist's authority. Because he wasn't normal. He didn't go through the normal route of education and all that. So do you think he has authority? Because if you do, that's the authority I'm claiming. If you don't think he has authority, then I'm not even going to engage in this conversation. And so anyway, that's the conversation there. People are always very put off by that theory that I heard and I pass on, and that's okay. You don't have to agree with it. I didn't to begin with either, and that's totally fine. But that's some of the conversation surrounding that. The big idea here was basically to walk through that story to try to show the collision of worldviews between what appears to be a very two-part eschatology with John the Baptist, and we see this all throughout his teaching, not just this story, but we see this throughout all of his teachings and all of the Gospels earlier fit this. John has a very two-part eschatology, and Jesus' theology seems to very squarely not fit two-part, but fit three-part eschatology. So there you go. The idea that there's a messianic age, like that, whether there's a Messiah as a person. And again, Judaism didn't necessarily, they weren't nearly as wound up about looking for a Messiah person as they were understanding there was a messianic age. And they were probably looking for a person at this point in history more than any other point in history. It's still not nearly as dominant of a thought process as I think most Christians think it is. But so anyway, you have that presentation. So what would we do for discussion fodder? Well, head questions, you could definitely talk about the two-part, three-part. You could draw that out. You could discuss, does anybody have any questions? A lot of times there's a little bit of confusion of how that operates. You guys could discuss the two-part versus the three-part eschatology. I always get asked a lot if there's any sources. I have been told sources, but I have not encountered them yet. I got that directly from Ray. He taught me that multiple times when I was in Israel and Turkey, more than once, I should say. And there's books on the bibliography that he gave me that I know go into that on some level. I have not dealt with a resource that really dives into that head on directly yet. So I don't have, but maybe somebody can dig something up, and that can be part of your head conversation. As far as heart conversation, I don't know. I mean, there's the whole part of this that's about kind of like the point of the lesson about an explosive kingdom. Like that whole verse, it's always so confusing about the kingdom has been advancing by violence and violent men lay hold of it. And I like to suggest that I think that should more appropriately be understood as the kingdom of God advances explosively, and explosive people, and this idea of prots. I think there's a direct Hebrew tie to Jesus' lineage, and he's a descendant of prots, Perez, you say in the English, but prots means to explode out. He was one that exploded out of the womb, and so and I think Jesus' point is that there's an explosive kingdom. And if you want to be a part of the kingdom, you're going to have to lay hold of it. You're not just going to like be able to sit back and kind of like, the kingdom's not going to come to you. You got to be ready to jump in there. And this is John the Baptist, like fiery chutzpah. And he's trying to tell people like John the Baptist understands the kingdom. So maybe there's a heart conversation about what is our relationship with the kingdom? Because there's a lot of people that have been wounded, hurt. They deal with their own church trauma, whatever that might be, and it has. So have a conversation about that. It's one thing to have to deal with that baggage and to pursue the therapy and to do all that stuff. It's another thing to be able to detach the things that God is doing in the world, the kingdom of God, and to be able to pull that apart from, like maybe I'm very hesitant to like be all in on the church or whatever it might be. But am I also hesitant to be all in on what God's doing? Because that would be where it would overflow into, I want to be ready to go when because what God is doing isn't spiritually abusive. What God is doing doesn't incite trauma. What God is doing is restorative. It's healing. It's wholeness. It's it's productive. It's bringing shalom to chaos. And so because this other stuff has made me hesitant and nervous, has that actually made me hesitant about the things is there something else I'm missing out on? Maybe there's a heart conversation there. And then hands conversation. Is there anything I need to, is there anything I could do in my life, practically speaking, hands question, where the kingdom of God is accessible to me if I want it, and I'm simply not ready. I'm not bursting through the door. I'm not laying hold of it, and I could. It would require a little bit of chutzpah. It would require a little bit of fire. It would require a little bit of intentionality and tenacity. But I could lay hold of the kingdom, and I'm not, for whatever reason. And maybe there's a conversation that you could have there. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Maybe there's something in there that will help you facilitate a discussion. Was a fun conversation. It's one of my, I feel fondly about this episode, and I like it. So hopefully you guys enjoy talking about it. We'll talk to you in the next discussion video.